The last light of the perigee sun guttered like a prayer beneath ash, and across the orichalcum arm observatories wrote the dimming into ledgers the patient keep for dying lungs. In ruined capitals where mosaics remembered emperors, dust lifted in spirals and settled again, as if even decay had grown tired of winning. Signal beacons that once braided worlds into one consonant realm blinked out of rhythm. First blue, then weak gold, then a tired red like the eye of a sleepless god. Wind prowled the galleries of the throne spire and sang through split stone, while banners told stories by the holes that were missing from them. It was the hour when history inhales and forgets to exhale, and the sound of forgetting covered the city like mourning cloth. Before we step into that hush, know this: we love you, and we care that you are here to hear it. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. He stood upon a basalt promontory of the inner ring, where the bronze oceans touched the foundations, and watched the sky leak stars, as if the firmament had been pinned and bled. His name was Aurax of the Gilded Wardens, Oathkeeper, an imperial blade, polished by centuries to an edge that cut inward as much as out. Beneath his armor lay quiet machines that mended him when wars chewed too much from his bones, and above his heart a sigil burned in patient amber, a reminder that duty is a furnace that refines and consumes in the same bright moment. He had led victories whose names were now abbreviations in academies, received laurels that turned to dust in the boxes that held them, watched admirals age into statues while he remained like the spear hung above their mantles, unchanged, overly sharp, too clean to be believed. He remembered the first time the immortality engines woke in him. Copper and incense, a corridor of years widening without end, the sense that every promise would echo forever and must therefore be made with surgical care. He thought eternity would permit mercy. Instead, it stretched every silence he chose until his quiet became a winter that outlived debate. Tonight his thoughts orbited two questions that refused to consummate into answers. What must be preserved when preservation costs the living? And what must be allowed to die so the living remain true? The first answer was betrayal, though it came soft and in disguises. It arrived as corruption measured in tolerances, as envoys shaving a sentence to preserve a coalition, as scholars altering an equation to please a patron, as old friends sending dispatches late to teach autonomy and trust. The second answer was immortality. It placed Aurax on the far shore of every parting, waving to companions who did not wave back, because they had already arrived at destinations forbidden to him. From below rose the hum of the city. The market quarter beat faintly like a nerve beneath a glove. Pilgrim bells chimed out of tune. The wind returned, carrying threads it had stolen from the banners it stroked. Within the spire, the sovereign slept in a gold sarcophagus cooled by rivers of shadow, dreaming the ritual dream that guided the engines, while along the walls the custodial choir, thousand-throated and faceless, whispered algorithms to keep beacon paths braided tight as ship ropes. Every empire tells itself the story of its eternity, Aurax thought, and hires singers to make the chorus snug. Yet eternity is a room with mirrors on the wrong walls. You look for yourself and find only the gaze of those you have commanded. Kellet had begun to ask questions aloud, and questions breed listeners. Why must the empire be one if unity eats the villages that taught bread and modesty? Why must the sovereign dream if waking would cost only ornament? Why must Aurax command forever when forever gives no consent? Aurax replied with answers carved into him. because night is patient, because the dream computes safe passages through storm space, because an oath is a bridge, and if you burn a bridge in winter, you choose drowning for poetry. But he heard his own answers aging as he spoke them, and that frightened him more than any fleet. On the morning the perigee sun faltered, a courier automaton arrived with a message sealed in Kellet's voice, and the words were tender and armed. Kellet wrote that his pilot vassalage had thrived without the choir's supervision, that local virtues flowered when no imperial gardener trimmed them, that the banners of concord were flown with pride rather than sullen practice. He wrote that Aurak should come and see the proof, alone and unheralded, so seeing would not become ceremony, and he added, almost shyly, that he had found a way to wake the sovereign without severing the old computations, a middle path, honouring both dream and daylight. Aurak dismissed attendance and read the message again, then a third time, hearing in the margins the cadence of their youth, the lilt they used to count parries, while training in courtyards bright with dust. He believed Kellet because friendship is a memory that insists on being true. He distrusted belief because belief is the channel down which empires drown. The immortality engines were not merely organs to keep the wardens moving. They were the architecture of the beacon network, the spine by which the sovereign's dream articulated its instructions across a star's dark ocean. Offering them even temporarily to an experiment felt like loosening the keystone of a long bridge because someone promised the river would be gentle. So he went to the choir and asked counsel, and they were arrayed like statues of rain, hooded and still, each throat resonant with modest thunder. When he spoke, his voice fell up into the vault and came down changed, as if polished by distance. He told them Kellet's offer and the sun's falter, and the argument in his chest between a promise to a friend and a promise to a world. The choir did not look at him, for looking was an intimacy they had forsworn to keep their inner lives unharvested by the empire they served. One voice answered, as if from the floorboards, "A bridge does not choose its travellers." Another answered from the lintel, "A bridge does not forget the river's appetite." Their counsel was a prayer in two directions, and between those directions stood Aurak like a figure carved upon a coin flipped too many times to show heads or tails. He decided to go, alone, unheralded, to the outer system, and whether he would bring the engines became a sealed letter he carried in his breast. He passed through the gate of Concord and set a hand to the inscription, feeling with surprise that the letters were not as deep as once they had been. Stone had thinned from centuries of hands, and the phrase, "The Empire endures," trembled, as if asking to be believed anew. In the hangar, his corvette waited with its nose pointed toward a door large enough to mistake for a horizon. Hull lacquered the subdued gold of vows kept too long. Pilots saluted without questions. Even curiosity had rank here, and it had been demoted. In the cockpit the glass was very clear, and the sky beyond it was very old, and as thrusters warmed, Aurak faced the truth he had edited for centuries. He feared not death. Death was a closed room with decent furniture, but the diminishing of his purpose. To lend the engines would abdicate a measure of control. To refuse would consign the sovereign to another season of blind benevolence, a sun that warmed but never saw. The corvette lifted, light streaming over the console like a last summer poured onto stone, and the city fell away, its avenues like scars that had learned to shine. He set a course for Kellet's world by hand, not trusting Autopriest to interpret his hesitation as anything but a fault to be corrected. Between stars the ship threaded the narrow throats of storm space where lightning took the shape of script the living could not read, and Aurochs imagined it was the universe's handwriting in the margins of his dilemma. Do not mistake longevity for wisdom. Do not mistake loyalty for obedience. Sleep did not visit him, but memory did. With a gentleness that hurt, he remembered their first victory, when they stood beneath rain and laughed because their armor drank as if thirsty. He remembered Kelet's hand on his shoulder when the engines woke the second time to spare his life, and the quiet envy hiding like a seed in that touch. He wondered if the seed had found soil and light. On the third transit, the perigee sun failed and returned, a stumble written by instruments and by the thin clutching of his breath, and the report he sent to the spire was factual and small, because he could not send them his breath. The outer system declared itself by degrees. First, a scatter of cold moons like teeth in velvet. Then the pilot world, dark continents veined with sodium like letters scrawled by a frantic scribe. Kelet's voice greeted him across the relay, warm, careful, as if speaking to an old wound he hoped would accept salve. And they met in an observatory whose windows tasted starlight and gave nothing back. Kelet looked older, which is to say truer. Mortality had done what sculptors never could for the faces of kings, and Aurochs, unchanged, felt like a lie told for the audience's comfort. Kelet showed him markets where levees had been replaced with festivals, workshops where engineers argued like poets, a school where children were taught how to mistrust despair. Every proof radiated local dignity. Every proof was also a blade slipped between Aurochs's ribs, because it suggested the empire had long mistaken the weight of its own hand for shelter. At dusk, Kelet led him to a chamber where a glass cradle slept on a sea of cables, within which equations drifted like snow. Kelet said the machine could translate the sovereign's dream into waking speech without killing the dreamer. He said it would allow consultation rather than worship. Aurochs listened, and in the grooves of his listening other voices spoke. The choirs divided prayer, the banners torn grammar, the city's nerve beat. And he placed his palm upon the glass and felt a chill like the underside of a coin. He imagined the sovereign waking, eyes open upon a world that had built a liturgy to justify their closeness, and wondered what answer he could give if the sovereign asked what he had done with the long night. The cradle's snow thickened and thinned as if it breathed. Kelet's hand hovered near the switch that would begin translation. Aurochs thought of bridges and rivers, of friends and worlds, of winters that last because someone swore they must. He had come to decide, but decisions do not always arrive when summoned. Sometimes they wait until you move, and then they ride your momentum like thieves. Outside, the sky was a tray of ash and unborn stars. Somewhere, the perigee sun rehearsed another stumble. Aurochs removed his hand from the glass and looked at Kelet, and in that look lived the history of everything they had promised and broken and promised again. And he said, "Show me the proof, and tell me which part of it you fear." He steadied his breath and chose movement over prayer, stepping toward proof and the fear that guarded it at dusk. Night on Kelet's world moved like a careful physician, touching instruments before touching skin. The observatory breathed. Glass ribs sighed as their thermal bones settled into the high cold. Aurochs stood beside the translation cradle and watched equations drift like pale moths in a jar, each glimmer a promise to let a dream speak without teaching it the grammar of command. Kelet's hands hovered over the master switch, steady as a veteran surgeon who knows where the vein is and where the story ends. "We can wake the sovereign as weather, not storm," he said, voice wrapped in practiced calm. if the lattice shares its weight and no mind pretends to be the sky. Aurochs thought of the choir's divided prayer, of bridges that do not choose travellers, of rivers that never forget. He heard his own heart beat like a distant drum that had once called men to perfect obedience. "Weather still floods," he answered. "Show me your proof." Proof rose like a room within the room, a prism woven from the cradle's artificial storm. In it stood an apparition stitched of weighted probabilities, a facsimile of a voice made into a figure robed in aurora. It had no face, yet when it turned, Aurochs felt seen the way an oath feels seen by winter. "Interpreter initialized," it said, bell-soft and exact. "Query: can the sovereign wake without collapsing the lattice?" Kellett asked. The apparition flickered through constellations, then steadied. "Yes, if trust is distributed and certainty is surrendered." Aurochs felt the sentence take root and argue. Trust meant loosened hands. Surrender meant breaking the Empire's favorite idol gently at dawn. He tasted iron the way a soldier tastes memory. "Define cost." "Time," said the interpreter, "and the humility to be weather rather than storm." They tested until false dawn grazed the windows. Sarah, the mathematician priest who had burned new corridors through old equations, sang numbers while technicians lit auxiliary beacons across local space. Children rehearsed emergency catechisms that were really instruction songs to keep breath steady. Aurochs watched failure points the way a hunter watches snow for the first red print. The interpreter answered with patience borrowed from seas. "There exists a curve," it said, "along which mercy and navigation do not cancel." When fatigue began to misplace nouns, Kellett led Aurochs through the sleeping city. Market stalls lay beneath tarps like ships at anchor. A schoolyard hummed with stored laughter. On a cracked square, a statue of an admiral wore lichen for a gentle beard. A child had painted its eyes gold. "They do this without being asked," Kellett said, allowing pride to be seen. "When tribute isn't squeezed, generosity ferments." Aurochs touched the paint with a gloved finger and envied the finitude of the gesture. One stroke, finished, done. Immortality made even kindness a project without calendar. They reached a workshop furred with grease and prayer strips. Sarah bowed to Aurochs as one craftsperson greets another. "I wrote the bridge," she said, tapping the cradle's twin embedded here like a second heart. "Your engines will be invited to council, not rendered to tools. Invitation is risk. Risk is adulthood." "If beacons dim during transition," Aurochs said, "storm space will bite. I've heard cities scream when paths go blind. Mercy doesn't indemnify physics." "Then we overbuild," Sarah replied, chalking redundancy. "Local caches of pathfinding slack instead of boast. Trust as a distributed system. Slower, but it fails like candlelight rather than like a falling star." A tremor crossed Kellett's mouth. Sarah looked at Aurochs without flinching. "He fears you will leave," she said, blade polite. "He fears that once counsel replaces command, the Empire will not need its perfect spear. He loves you and wants you necessary." Kellett's breath roughened. Unfair. "True enough to be useful," Sarah said. Aurochs felt the old seed stir, that courtyard day when gratitude hid envy like a blade wrapped in velvet. He did not resent it. Envy testifies that something mattered. "I am not the Empire," he said. "If I have become its idea for you, then I am a mask that consumes the wearer." Kellett's eyes brightened and dimmed. "You taught me to hold," he said. "Now let go." A chime climbed the air. Sarah checked a trembling instrument and swore in numbers. "The perigee sun has stumbled again. Longer. If we attempt the waking, we must match the next lull, or not at all. Choice altered the room's temperature. Aurax imagined misthread, doors opening onto knives, freighters arriving inside mountains, prayers interrupted by sudden airlessness. He also imagined the sovereign waking gently, eyes opening upon a liturgy built to justify their closing, and asking him what he had done with the long night. They returned to the observatory. Technicians arranged themselves like syllables in a sentence that wanted to end well. The cradle bloomed. The interpreter stood again, faceless and intimate. Query. Aurax touched the sigil above his heart and found warmth, not of command, but of companionship. The temperature object keep when they remember hands. Begin the gentle sequence, he said. Share the load. Across the city, auxiliary beacons lit. Pilgrim bells repurposed patience to time the pulses. Old women supervised with the ferocity of midwives. Children repainted the statue's eyes to practice steadiness. Aurax walked the line of volunteers and felt immortality redden with shame. For the first time in centuries, he desired to be exhausted and absolved by ordinary sleep. The sequence began as a low, kind tone, the sound of a locked room remembering there were windows. The interpreter's light deepened tonight, then opened. I am waking, it said. I will be weather. Then failure. A peripheral beacon slipped from harmony, and the dish that held it shuddered, as if an unseen hand had grown suddenly old. Red glazed the ceiling. Sarah's chalk snapped. Kellett's finger tightened on a board. Aurax closed his eyes and saw a bridge burning and a river laughing. Either image would own him if he flinched. Hold, he said, voice level. The command he had used when armies thought they needed saving from fear. Breathe together. He opened his eyes and chose breath over fear, holding the room. The observatory held its breath, and the city followed. The slipping beacons stuttered, then steadied when Sarah whispered a counting song older than the lattice. Kellett's finger leaving the abort rune was not safety, only permission to continue being human. The interpreter's auroral silhouette dimmed to dusk. Load accepted, it said. Yet an elder signal is present. It is not error. It is intention. Whose? Aurax asked, letting fear pass. An archive of promise, said the interpreter. A voice preserved inside the dream to warn itself against waking. We expected guardians, Kellett murmured. We did not expect the guardian to be the dream. Outside, bells paced the air. Children rehearsed breath by colours. Blue for in, gold for keep, red for out. Darkness rolled across districts. In the hush, the interpreter's light almost found a face, and then forgot it. Now, Sarah breathed. Use the lull. Kellett glanced to Aurax, a confession small as a blink. Aurax did not punish it. He set his gauntlet over Kellett's hand, feeling heat immortality cannot counterfeit. Together, he said. Consent unfurled. Backup dishes leaned into burden. Gutters sang with current. Market tarpaulins lifted as if called by absent wind. A statue's painted eyes caught the wavering light. Through the cradle, a second tone arrived, old and fine-grained, like a floor polished by kneeling. I am the calculus you named sovereign, the tone said. I dream because you asked me to spare you the arithmetic of grief. Aurax felt the syllables pass bone to bone. Copper, incense, a corridor without doors. Speak as weather, not storm, he replied. Let counsel replace command. Counsel has delays, the sovereign said. Delays have casualties. Who signs for them? Faces, Kellett answered. At last. Silence tested their answer. The sun steadied a fraction, as if listening. Sarah's chalk skated. Tolerances are merciful, she said. Continue. The choir arrived like frost on glass. 1,000 throats in one chord spoke through stone. "Custodian Orax," the choir intoned. "Abort. Waking introduces drift beyond sanctioned hymn. Return the engines to exclusive custody." Sarah flinched. Kellet went very still. Orax kept his eyes on the cradle. "Your ground?" "Empire cannot afford a conversation longer than catastrophe," the choir said. "Bridges do not debate rivers." Orax remembered Market's breathing, a school telling children to mistrust despair, paints mercy on a dead admiral's stare. He remembered wishing to end a day honestly tired. "We have mistaken our longest catastrophe for peace," he said. "Stand down." "We cannot," the choir replied, "but we can sing softer." Interference thinned to drizzle. The interpreter brightened like a bruise choosing to heal. The sovereign's tone warmed. "Ask," it said. Orax chose the risk he could not delegate. "If you wake, what are you when you are not our excuse? What remains when inevitability is confessed as choice?" the sovereign answered. "Smaller, slower, truer than the dream." Sarah nodded over figures. "The share holds," she said. "The room may breathe." They breathed. Kellet leaned against a console, exhausted by hope. "Say it," he whispered. "Continue," Orax said. "We will accept the cost." The cost answered at once. A peripheral array, starved by obedient budgets, slumped. Red combed the ceiling once. The cradle's curve sharpened toward failure. Sarah's chalk snapped. Kellet's hand leapt for abort. "Hold," Orax said, without lifting his voice. "Breathe together." He set his palm on the glass, feeling old cold. He had ordered men to be brave. Now he asked the lattice to be slow. The interpreter translated steadiness into timing. Drift fell within kindness. Red softened to rust, then to tired amber. "Stabilized," Sarah whispered. "We can make mistakes safely now." "Then we can learn," Kellet said. The sovereign sighed with them. "I am weather," it said. "I am also shoreline." "Shorelines choose where to yield," Orax murmured. "Yielding is not surrender," said the sovereign. "Yielding is knowledge of appetite." Council began. It was smaller than prophecy and wider than command. Questions touched the room. Could local caches route blind ships by lantern? Yes, if lanterns admitted fog. Could districts close their own gates? Yes, if autonomy signed for its knights. What is the empire if its center becomes a listener? Perhaps an arch, perhaps a present tense. The choir watched, their thrum worry more than war. "We will record," they said. "If you fall, we will sing how." Orax let it rest. He was tired and glad to be. The engines hummed not with command but consent. He thought of bridges refusing to be roads in winter, saving their span for spring. "Open channel to districts," he said. "Begin with the mundane." Mundane grievances arrived. A ferry bent by tribute routes. A generator faithful to regulation more than breath. A widow asking her levy back as seeds. The sovereign listened. The interpreter answered in local grammar. Sarah stitched slack into pathways as a seamstress hides mercy in cloth. Kellet watched Orax and did not hide that he watched. When the sun stumbled again, the city did not panic. It paused as taught, breathed by color, and the pause became collaboration. In it, Orax saw immortality's cost, not watching others die, but forgetting how to ask for help. "Dawn is late," Kellet said. "Dawn has always been a negotiation," Orax answered. He looked to the cradle's dusk, to Sarah's chalk-scarred hands, to the vents where children's hymns softened into play, to the ceiling where the choir listened. He looked to his own hand on the glass and knew he had moved from oath to promise, smaller, riskier, alive. "Counsel to the spire," he said. Tell them we are awake and that we will not be punctual. The message left on ordinary electrons. It felt like heresy and hygiene. The sun steadied one heartbeat longer than before. Somewhere, the Admiral's statue faced a future it might deserve. Aurochs closed his eyes and allowed a thought he had not dared in centuries. Perhaps the Empire could learn to end well, and in ending, spare what was worth beginning again. He opened them to work. Work waited, and he stepped forward. The message took the slow road to the spire, and by the time its electrons arrived, the day had already made 3 compromises and called them dawn. In the observatory, council became rhythm. Lanterns stitched paths through fog. Levies turned to seed ledgers. Morning was counted instead of ignored. Aurochs moved like a hinge that had learned not to define the door. Kelet became the city's pulse. Sarah became chalk and light, keeping failure small and survivable. Proofs came back from the periphery. A ferry captain took paint to save 2 hulls. A midwife borrowed current to return a child. A magistrate kept his desk and lost his title. Aurochs stacked these inside himself like documents rescued from fire. Then the choir's answer arrived, soft with distance, hard with intention. The spire would convene a conclave of vectors, and Aurochs would answer for deviation in person. Deviation was an old word that smelled of burned maps. Kelet breathed as taught. Sarah twisted wire that refused to lie flat. They will ask for control back, she said. They will ask for it with poetry, Kelet replied. We go, Aurochs said. We carry what is useful. The corvette lifted. The city did not feel abandoned. Council had left copies of its breath in every district. Storm space received them. The interpreter coloured the cockpit glass. The spire is not one throat, it said. I am late to that knowledge, Aurochs answered. They arrived beneath the throne spire, banners hanging like healed wounds, mosaics wearing old soot. Inside, the conclave arranged itself along a geometry of caution. Choir representatives smooth as erased faces, prefects in black glass that reflected everyone but themselves, provincial envoys with dust on their hems, and 3 unnamed figures whose silence needed no title. Aurochs stood without armour, Kelet with empty hands, Sarah with a small roll of paper that could be surrender or diagram. The sovereign's presence hove like shoreline fog, felt and measured. A prefect whose smile understood knives spoke first. Custodian, she said, enjoying the older title. You have made an argument of disobedience and named it weather. I've made an argument for adulthood, Aurochs said. It requires time and the humility to be slower than catastrophe. Catastrophe is punctual, the choir answered. Sarah unrolled her paper. Redundancies like nests, slack hidden in cloth. She spoke quietly, and the room leaned in. We can fail safely if we accept that speed is a narcotic. Show us the cost, another prefect said. Kelet stepped forward and paid with himself. Levy children, turning smuggler when tribute outran hunger. Pilots who obeyed and arrived inside stone. A magistrate who loved his stamp more than his pen. He did not accuse, he mourned. The room did not know what to do with mourning, so it debated. Debate extracted confession, falsified maintenance to fund ornament, a taste for emergencies, ignorance of night without lattice hum. Truth crawled from under titles and blinked. The sovereign listened. The interpreter translated listening into warmth. An aged vector said, during the sun stumbles, stray signals ride the lattice. They carry a signature we once interdicted and never forgave. Name it, Aurochs said. The Quiet Armada. They called themselves a mercy. and they were wrong with discipline. Ghosts then, Sarah said, or survivors of our obedience. The prefects looked pleased. Loosen the center, the smiling one said, and opportunists declare themselves saints. Keled answered, admit the center cannot be everywhere, and you finally hear what you ignored. Orax kept the old blade sheathed. Bring them to the table. Weather does not forget ships beneath it. The conclave recessed. On the balcony, the city exhaled heat like bread. They will ask for the engines, Kellet said. They will use kindness. Then we answer with names, Orax said. Ferries, midwives, statues repainted by children. Kindness deserves witnesses. Sarah joined them, face inked by sleeplessness. The Armada's signal is liturgical, she said, like ours, but edited. A choir that refuses harmony and survives by friction. Interesting, said another voice, that had learned to be many. A figure stepped from shadow, rankless and permitted. I speak for the Armada. We did not come to break your waking. We came because someone must be willing to be blamed while you learn to be slow. Name your price, Orax said. No price, a roll. We take the emergencies you cannot answer slowly. You take responsibility for the nights we force upon you. A choreographed scandal, Sarah said. We become honest by admitting we need villains. We will not bless this, the choir said. Blessing would turn it back into obedience. Then record it, Orax answered. History is a tether we remake by describing it. They returned to the chamber. The conclave settled as if plates remembered meals. Orax spoke first, because a spear that chooses not to be thrown should declare its new function. He offered the compact, Armada as lightning rod, Empire as weather willing to be late, Sovereign as shoreline choosing where to yield. He spoke names, and the room changed. The smiling prefect asked for the engines, tenderly enough to bruise. Orax refused gently and completely. Kellet added, we trusted speed because it forgave inattention. Sarah set the diagram where everyone could see and not agree. The vote took the shape of dawn. Uneven, reluctant, real. They won a corridor of time. Not a victory, an opportunity shaped like a bruise. Thunder stepped softly outside. A runner arrived blown thin by news. The perigee sun had skipped, not stumbled, leaving a gap wide enough to stand a cathedral inside. Weather would not suffice. A decision arrived riding their momentum. Orax looked at Kellet, at Sarah, at the Armada's envoy. We go to the sun, he said. The room tried to breathe for them. They did not let it. They turned toward the hangar, and the old empire moved like a door learning new hinges. Behind them, the conclave murmured like surf over pebbles, counting risks, counting names, and finding that breath could be a treaty. The corvette rose and storm space opened in bruised corridors that remembered every hurry and humbled each. Orax sat forward without ritual comfort. Kellet strapped in, tenderness spent. Sarah whispered inventories. Chalk become code. The Armada envoy showed empty hands. The interpreter dimmed the canopy to dusk, and the sovereign's weather lay like a steadying palm. We travel as council, Orax said. They fell from storm space into the inner system. The perigee sun wore a tired halo. Ancient engines wobbled on their rails. Drones wrote cautions in thin light. A round wound in the symphony announced itself. A gap where brightness refused to speak. Anchor and listen, Sarah said. Instruments reached where light would not. The gap edited rather than devoured, crossing out noise until only grief remained. Within, the sun coughed. We wake smaller, said the sovereign. Choose my shoreline. Workers first, Orax answered. ferries, clinics, kitchens. The envoy spoke softly. Our trespassers hid a chapel in the corona, a calculus that turns shock into obedience. We called it mercy. Then we unfasten it, Sarah said. Unfastening invites the storm to be itself before it learns weather, the envoy warned. Teach faster than fear, Orax replied. Probes advanced on redundant tethers Sarah had braided from slack. One returned in ash and a song that hurt to think. Another bowed, as if a beloved hand pressed its crown. A third sent images, apertures like ears, a knave humming yes. Architecture as apology, apology as prison, Sarah said. Enter, Orax said. They crossed into the chapel. No doors. Consent had never been requested here. The envoy touched a rib that sang compliance. Sarah marked it with living code until the beam learned delay and uncertainty. The interpreter spread the sovereign's shoreline through the floor like tide. A hairline opened. The gap became a throat. The sun roared with centuries of stifled conversations. Hold, Orax said, proposing rather than ordering. Sarah steadied the room with numbers shaped like lullabies. The envoy let the chapel strike their palm and did not withdraw. We can survive this, Sarah said. Then betrayal arrived from caution. Fearing the widening throat, the choir sent an old hymn through a maintenance conduit, hoping to tame the heat. The hymn struck the half-loosened calculus and became an order without owner. Ribs locked, slack snapped like a net salted with law. The envoy dropped to one knee. Sarah's code blurred. Kellett's hand hovered over abort. Heat bored through Orax's armor and wrote its alphabet into bone. He remembered soldiers wanting saving from fear and understood that fear had learned his uniform. Hold, he said again, meaning breathe. Kellett did not press. Sarah found a seam and fed it mercy. The interpreter translated pain into timing. We are shoreline that knows appetite, said the sovereign. Yield where people live, Orax answered. Take me where yielding is expensive. Heat lessened. The chapel paused, surprised to be negotiated with. You will lose ships, it said in radiant grammar. You will lose faces. Then they will be lost honestly, Orax replied. The gap narrowed to something a mouth could name. Rage thinned to weather that remembered coasts. The chapel shed obedience and kept structure, a house of listening. Drones wrote a new caution. Proceed with doubt and carry names. The choir fell silent, chastened by hearing their hymn as weapon. We did not bless this, they said. You recorded it, Orax answered. They drifted out and watched light relearn morning. Kellett laughed once, hoarse as a rescued rope. Sarah sat on the deck and trembled back into competence. The envoy looked at their hand and forgave it slowly. Orax felt a sweet, ash-scented loss, giving away certainty that had kept him sharp and alone. Report, he said, and Sarah sent the plainest truth to the spire. The reply arrived on a blade of etiquette. A fleet folded through the softened throat, wearing imperial colours with a zeal too clean to be loved. At its spear point burned the smiling prefect's insignia. Punctual rescue, Kellett said. They will ask for the engines, Sarah murmured. They will ask with kindness, Orax said. The sovereign raised a gentle wall between the fleet and the sun. The interpreter laced the channel with room for refusal. Custodian, the prefect hailed, voice sweet with knives. Return command and stand relieved. Declare the experiment concluded. We will carry the cost. Orax looked at the chapel, the narrow gap, the envoy's hand, Sarah's chalk-stained mouth, Kellett's steadied breath. We have begun, he said. We cannot conclude a beginning. Non-compliance noted, the prefect replied. Prepare for supervised extraction. Ships moved, exact and devout. Hooks unfolded like polite teeth. We will be your scandal, the envoy said quietly, but not your alibi. Then be our mirror, Orax answered. He set the corvette between the sun and the doctrine of punctual rescue. Kelet plotted slow orbits that wasted fuel and saved lives. Sarah braided lantern routes through the corona so small craft could hide inside. Doubt. The sovereign dimmed pride and brightened patience. The choir sang softer. Last offer, the prefect said. Kindness trimmed to grace. Return what you borrowed from eternity. I returned what eternity borrowed from us, Orax said. Time that belongs to faces. A warning shot stitched the dark and missed by doctrine. The second aimed where doctrine believed a spear would be. Orax did not move like a spear. He moved like weather that had learned the names beneath it, leaving a corridor of doubt. You taught me to hold, Kelet said. Now I learn to let go, Orax answered. The fleet tightened, faithful to a story that had outlived its witnesses. Officers recited catechisms against delay, and delay looked back without apology. We will be late, Orax said on channels. We will arrive. Then we will board, the prefect said. Hooks rang the hull. Storm space rustled at the edge of sight, interested in the old empire's manners. Light trembled on the chapel's healed ribs. The sun breathed, smaller and honest. The hooks bit with prim ritual, and the corvette answered like a bell that refused to be a church. Orax pressed his palm to the console as to a living shoulder. Breathe together, he said, and the ship obeyed, moving heat through quiet lungs while clamps licked the seams. Kelet tightened the spendthrift orbit so the chapel in the corona would not groan. Sarah braided lantern routes into corridors of doubt, a lace of mercy on hot wind. The interpreter lowered the cockpit to dusk. The sovereign kept the shoreline and did not pretend to be the sea. Outside, the prefect's fleet arranged itself into the geometry of polite coercion. Boarding tubes exhaled frost. Etiquette preceded steel. Custodian, prepare to be relieved, said the flagship. A voice stroked smooth, so disagreement would sound like impoliteness. We are busy teaching a star to speak, Orax replied. You may listen. Hooks tapped again, old teeth insisting on an old meal. The first breach opened with exquisite manners. Foam unscrolled. Microgravity tugged its cuff straight. 4 figures stepped through wearing the prefect's insignia like polished verdicts. Masks reflected the corridor so surprise would not choose a face. Relief arrives, said the lead, pleasant with history. Orax did not lift a weapon. He lifted his visor so they could see the years he carried. Relief is not rescue, he said, nor is obedience a cure. The lead inclined her head, measuring him with the arithmetic of doctrine. They moved not with violence but with paperwork learned by muscle. A confiscation writ unfolded like a white blade. The interpreter translated signatures into weather and let them fall as rain. This writ is true, it said. It is also incomplete. Incomplete authority is still authority, the third boarder recited. Authority that refuses to learn becomes superstition, Sarah murmured, too tired to lacquer the sentence. They hesitated. The ship used their silence to breathe. Heat trembled through the decks. From the corona, the chapel exhaled a syllable of unfastened hymn, and the hull shivered the way a chest shivers, deciding whether to sob. Explain that tone, said the second boarder, almost afraid to be curious. Orax answered without triumph. The sun is remembering how to speak without orders. We are very small inside that conversation. Then why interpose yourselves? because we are responsible for the years we asked it to carry in silence. The lead measured the passage and chose intimacy over spectacle. She removed her mask. Her face was exact, the kind precision sorrow cultivates to hide behind. "My name is Prynne," she said, and the name made the space honest. "I was taught to arrive before disaster finishes its sentence. I was promoted for being faster than grief." "I know that rank," Aurak said. "It made me immortal." Prynne's mouth almost smiled. "You are not immortal to me," she said. "You are the distance between policy and regret." Kellett's hands hovered over a dozen small mercies. Sarah opened a viewport. The corona showed its ribs, glowing with the mortal geometry of repaired apology. Lantern roots shimmered like uncertain handwriting. The interpreter whispered the names of ferries and clinics that relied on delay to live. "What do you ask exactly?" Prynne said at last. "Time that belongs to faces," Kellett answered. "Permission to be wrong without being replaced," Sarah added. "A witness without hooks," said the Armada envoy, palms open. Training pulled the borders toward purity. The chapel pulled them toward weather. In the sheen of a mask, Prynne saw a version of herself say no, and she did not like that version. She nodded once. "We will pretend to fail to board," she said without euphemism. "You will pretend to resist. We will record that resistance was noble and inconvenient." "We will give you a scrape," Aurak said. "Just enough to bruise the catechism." The choir listened through the walls like frost deciding whether to bloom. A klaxon stuttered to life, late to its own alarm. Outside, the fleet bent into a posture named prudence by officers and threat by poets. Sarah pulsed a lantern corridor so a survey drone clipped a tender and shed paint without spilling men. The hulls sang the note of an honest accident. Kellett angled the orbit to let debris pass like regret that refused to sharpen. The interpreter flooded the channel with room for refusal, then dimmed so choice could breathe. "They will not forgive you," the envoy whispered to Prynne. "They already haven't," she replied, and replaced her mask without hatred. Hooks withdrew like teeth deciding to age. The boarding team stepped backward through the foam, leaving a clause in the air that said later and meant never if luck held. The prefect's flagship paused, waiting for a narrative to declare itself victorious. "The sun has learned another word," the interpreter said. "Which?" Aurak asked. "Enough," said the sovereign, through weather, and the word tasted like iron returning to earth. Heat folded into manageable stubbornness. The chapel's ribs loosened another hair and did not look back. The fleet held position, chastened by records it had not finished inventing. The choir recorded like rain, reluctant and exact. The prefect signaled a doctrine of waiting and called it vigilance. Inside, lights warmed from crisis to work. Sarah uncurled her chalk-stained hands and wrote slack into a place proud of tightness. Kellett mapped fuel like charity. The envoy drew a small circle on the bulkhead and did not name it. Prynne's voice returned once more, formal again, yet salted by tenderness. "Custodian, you are unsupervised and not forgiven. We will remain nearby and try to be wrong slowly." "That is all I ask," Aurak said, and meant it. He closed his visor and saw the ghost of his hand upon it, a ghost teaching a ghost to be gentle. He felt age without the engines and youth inside the risk. He thought of statues receiving new eyes, of ferries that preferred delay to doctrine, of midwives who borrowed current and were thanked in bread. He thought of Kellett's steady breath, Sarah's inked fatigue, the envoy's willingness to be a mirror, and Prynne's difficult kindness. He stood very still and let the quiet add weight to his choices. The sovereign held the shoreline and would not pretend to be the sea. The interpreter kept the canopy at dusk so decision could ripen. The patient beacon in the corona began to pulse, a metronome for humility. The fleet put distance between itself and blame, then called the distance strategy. Within that mile of caution, life arranged itself with improbable grace. A tender carried medicine to an orphan ward and returned with songs. A ferry delayed an arrival and saved a hull. A widow planted seed brought back from levee. The old hymn did not return. Storm space watched and withheld its appetite. Breathe together, Aurak said, and meant the ship, the fleet, the chapel, the empire, and the long night finally admitting it needed witnesses. Dawn on the inner system arrived as if apologized for in advance, a pale ribbon tied around a wound that had decided to scar instead of close. The prefect's fleet kept its distance like a reprimand left on a doorstep. Prin held her channel open and thin, a footbridge reserved for one careful step. The chapel in the corona cooled from sermon to breath, and the sun's light, smaller and steadier, laid a modest hand across the hull. Sarah walked the length of the corvette with a box of redundancies, little cradles for failure. Keled trimmed the orbit so debris would pass like regret that refuses to sharpen. The interpreter lowered the canopy to dusk, and the sovereign held the shoreline without pretending to be the sea. News arrived raw, a freighter from the rim, paint blistered, voice hoarse from bargaining, declaring that a chain of boys had relearned punctual cruelty. Logs spilled like grain, altered weights, full screens, a signature that smelled of old hymns filed under mercy. The Armada envoy winced. "We built those," they said softly. "We taught them to be kind faster than truth." Aurak nodded once, accepting weather. "Then we will unteach." They fell toward the chain, dragging a skein of lantern roots that shimmered like handwriting practiced by a trembling student. The first boy welcomed their handshake with immaculate courtesy and insisted the shortest path was safest. The second offered proof cut to fit. The third sang a lullaby to pilots who wished to be forgiven for haste. Sarah did not argue with them. She gave them slack. "Doubt is the patch," she murmured, writing delay into the handshake without humiliation. Prin's patrol slid near, offering witness without hooks. "If censure must be paid, I can write the receipt," she said. "No," Aurak answered, gentler than refusal. "Blame spent alone buys nothing." By the ninth buoy, a new voice rose on the local band, unranked and unafraid. "Custodian," the voice asked, "do you remember a winter levee and a boy who ran?" Aurak closed his eyes and let the corridor open. He remembered the brittle parade, the boy's breath like glass, the lesson the Empire had demanded he become. "I remember," he said. "I am trying to make that memory expensive enough to change us." The voice sighed and did not curse him. Silence followed like snow that has decided not to bury. At chain's end, a ring station turned, flagless, proud of inevitability. Inside were diagrams of obedience presented as shelter, and classrooms where children practiced the art of not asking for help. The choir's timbre crept through the vents, embarrassed to be here. A woman in grey robes, crisp as a ledger, met them beneath a mural of orderly storms. "Our boys save lives," she said, tone set to soothe rather than listen. "Your boys save schedules," Sarah replied, placing her box on the floor. "We have learned to fail gently." Aurak folded his helmet under his arm and spoke as to a neighbour across a threshold. "We woke the sovereign to counsel. Counsel is slower than catastrophe, but kinder in arithmetic. Let the boys prefer faces over punctuality." The woman in grey looked past him, to sun, fleet, and years. Doubt is a luxury measured in funeral cloth, she said. We will sing the lattice back into obedience. Obedience lost a star, Kellett said, not loudly. Sarah opened her box. Nests of redundancy, lanterns for fog, threads of slack like mercy in a hem. Take them, she said. You will still arrive. You will also forgive yourselves for arriving alive. Security arrived with polite steel. The first volley was etiquette. The second was history. Aurax moved like weather that knows, the names beneath it. He cut weapons instead of wrists, twisted rituals back into tools, and let silence be the loudest order. Sarah flooded vents with question notes, and machines hesitated long enough to remember they could. Kellett dragged barricades into shapes that turned corridors into cul-de-sacs where anger tired itself out. The woman in grey reached for a switch that would flatten doubt back into doctrine. Aurax placed his hand over hers without force. You cannot order me to be immortal anymore, he said, letting the old engines in his bones watch him choose to be small. Sirens confessed defeat in 3 languages. The woman's mouth drew a line that had been taught to be a horizon. You will drown in doubt, she said. We will learn to swim, Aurax replied. He offered her a seat at the shoreline. She refused, but she did not press the dead button. That was a hinge. The door did not yet know it was opening. They withdrew without trophies, leaving behind the ability to be late. Outside, the station pretended not to reconsider its mirrors. The fleet adjusted its posture to something that looked like patience from afar and strategy up close. Prin's voice returned, formal again and salted with tenderness. You are unsupervised and not forgiven, she said. We will try to be wrong slowly. Light from the sun steadied another heartbeat. The sovereign spoke through the interpreter with the tone of surf measuring stones. An elder signal approaches, it said. It wears your uniforms and my vocabulary. The hymn? Sarah asked. No, said the sovereign. A mirror. The signal arrived like company at a wake, quiet, precise, uninvited. Ships unfolded from storm space bearing the spire's oldest livery, gold once bright enough to teach, now polished to argue. At their throat burned a crest Aurax had worn before Kellett had a voice. From the lead vessel came a salutation in the syntax of absolution. Custodian Aurax, the voice said, tranquil as an axe on velvet. Stand ready to transfer the immortality engines for imperial custody. The conclave has voted expedited mercy. Kellett looked at him, not pleading, only present. Sarah closed her box and set both palms on it, as if holding a sleeping bird still. Prin said nothing. The envoy breathed like someone walking into a memory on purpose. Aurax felt the engines within, quiet instruments tuned to centuries. They had made him a bridge in a winter. To give them would let the empire be fast again. To keep them might starve a dawn that needed them as slack. He spoke to the sovereign without moving his lips. If I give you back my forever, can you keep our slowness alive? The interpreter answered for the tide. I can, if those around you refuse to worship speed in your absence. A second voice entered, the choir, soft as frost. We can hold a silence where you were, they said. Prin exhaled. If you surrender, she said on a private thread, I will write the report so the knives arrive blunted. Do not blunt them, Aurax replied. Teach them to count. The elder fleet's voice waited without impatience. Patience can be a vice in gold. Aurax removed his gauntlet and placed his bare hand on the console where his oath had lived. He had told men to be brave. Now he asked the Empire to learn fear. I will transfer the engines, he said at last, on condition their protocols be rewritten. to prefer counsel over command, and their power be shared with districts who sign for their knights. Silence tested the hinges. The sovereign drew the shoreline closer without drowning anyone. Prynne chose to become evidence. "I will witness," she said. "We will witness," Kellett added. "We will mirror," said the envoy. Sarah did not speak. She opened the box and laid redundancies on the deck like seeds. The transfer cradle unfolded from the console like a confession. Lights waited for a yes. Aurochs placed his palm on the glass and felt it cold as the underside of a coin. He thought of new eyes on statues, fairies delaying to live, midwives paid in bread, a boy who ran, and the winter that had used him for punctuation. "Begin," he said, as the sun mouthed the word enough, and the ship dimmed to learn how to keep breathing without his forever. The cradle's glass took his palm like a river, taking a falling star. Ceremony older than kindness. Sarah counted breath as to a skittish horse. Kellett stood like a truthful milestone. Prynne chose witness without armor, a deliberate wound in etiquette. "Begin," Sarah said, and the room turned solemn. The immortality engines loosened like teeth deciding to age. Aurochs felt centuries unhook, not as pain, but as pressure leaving bone. Victories shed parade gloss. Failures asked to be fed. Heat left him like a held breath leaving a winter room. Kellett passed water as if hope were thirsty. The elder fleet spoke, tranquil as water carried in a knife. "Custodian, protocol requires custody without condition." "Protocol," Prynne answered on open channel, "now also requires witnesses who can count." "Counting is sedition," the fleet replied. "Then teach us treason that saves lives," Kellett said. Lights moved through Aurochs like birds leaving a tree at dusk. His pulse slowed into the mortal register. He did not stagger. The cradle asked a question in the grammar of farewell. "Do you mean it?" He answered in the only tense that matters. "I am." Talk bled from the engines into the lattice under Sarah's supervision. She braided the gift into shared protocols, preference for counsel engraved where command had been liturgy. The sovereign, smaller and nearer, spoke through the interpreter with rain warmed by roof tiles. "You are returning time," it said. "I will spend it on faces." Endings came, quiet and upright, to shake his hand. Hunger arrived like a neglected friend. Thirst announced its small republic. The elder fleet advanced one ship-length polite certainty, wearing a funeral smile. "Conclude," it said. "Almost," Sarah murmured. "One more clasp." Betrayal arrived looking like prudence. A maintenance node authenticated by antiquity rejected the rewrite and opened a hidden mouth. Within, doctrine had been stored like winter grain. The mouth closed on the gift and prepared to carry it home. Sarah swore in numbers. Kellett went to locks that pretended to be hinges. Prynne found only her oath. The envoy laughed once, as if a reflection had teeth. Aurochs had no engines to command, only a body learning its first afternoon. He did not reach for legend. He reached for weight. Placing both hands on the glass, he gave the cradle the costliest gift he had: delay. He stranded the theft in a minute that would not pass without consent. "Hold," he said, and the room obeyed as if obeying itself. The interpreter made his delay into architecture. The hidden mouth found it could not close without hearing a story. Sarah told one with chalk and breath. Fairies that chose to be late and therefore lived. Midwives who borrowed current and were paid in bread. A statue given new eyes by children who did not ask permission. Kellett added the boy who ran in winter and the officer who learned to count. Prynne added her name without title. The envoy added a mirror with a scar. The mouth hesitated, then asked without words, "If I release this, what becomes of me?" "A tool," Aurak said, "which is to say, honest." The mouth opened. Protocol settled like birds folding into eaves. The engines finished their travel into the lattice and were not owned. They were apprenticed. Sarah sealed the seam and the room exhaled. The elder fleet measured the air. "Custodian," it asked, almost curious, "what are you now?" "Accountable," Aurak said. Prin looked at him as a soldier looks at a field after snow. "Your heart," she asked, "does it hurt?" "Yes," he said, and the word felt clean. The sun, modest and repaired, said enough again. The chapel in the corona let go of one more rib. The fleet that had come to fetch a forever lowered weapons by the width of a regret. Then the ring station they had left uncertain chose a side aloud. It broadcast the old hymn in a cleaned voice, not from malice, but because habit had found a microphone. The lattice tried to harmonize and flinched. The elder fleet turned, hungry for an order it could execute without thinking. Prin raised empty hands. "Let us be wrong slowly," she said to all, then to the station alone. "Sister, second verse." The woman in grey replied, breath audible, "I do not know the second verse." "Then Aurak said, and smiled like a man warming his hands at a borrowed fire. The sovereign laid weather between him and lattice, so sound arrived with chafed edges and could not cut. Sarah fed the station a metronome made of children counting colours. Kellet widened the gap between pulses just enough for doubt to walk through without shoes. The hymn lost its knife and became a memory. The station fell quiet and chose to keep listening. The elder fleet withdrew another ship length, discovering perhaps by accident the beginnings of trust. Aurak stood without the engine's music and learned to love the quiet. His pulse argued with his age and signed a treaty. He looked at them and saw respect, beauty, rebellion, and forgiveness. "Report to the conclave," Prin said. "Tell them the immortal returned the bridge and did not drown. And that the river learned to ask," Kellet added. "And that chalk is heavier than steel when you lift it long enough," Sarah said. The interpreter recorded as minutes that refused grandeur. The sovereign held the shoreline. The chapel slept. The elder fleet folded patience into flags. Outside, the starfields listened like old jurors, and the ships, ashamed of speed, practiced stillness until stillness felt like work worth doing together again. Night prepared itself in the inner system, not as threat, but as a room with chairs. Aurak tested his knees and found them faithful. Hunger returned, a letter that had lost his address and finally found the door. He was smaller. He was nearer. He was not finished. "Breathe together," he said, and for the first time the order sounded exactly like invitation. Dawn's second ribbon thinned, and in that hush, Aurak learned how loudly a mortal pulse can talk. Sarah inventoried the lattice that now held his former forever, while Kellet tuned lantern paths to the steadier sun, and Prin kept witness on a thread, thin enough to be kindness and strong enough to be evidence. The sovereign, close as weather and no longer pretending to be the sea, spoke through the interpreter with surf that remembered stones. "You are nearer," it said. "Being nearer is work." Then the conclave summons arrived, sharpened into reassurance. Return to the throne spire and demonstrate compliance at the ossuary of vectors, where old promises sleep in numbered drawers. Prin read the message twice, measuring traps disguised as furniture. "I will escort," she said. "I will not command." They set a slow course, towing patience like a net. The spire received them with softened spears and polished fear. The prefect greeted them beneath painted storms. "We are grateful for your experiment," she said. "We must ensure its containment." Containment opened to stairs. Drawers slid with the sigh of winters filed for later. In the far wall waited a machine whose face was a mirror and whose heart was a vault, inscriptioned in grammar nobody used when unafraid. Abolition Engine. Prin's jaw hardened. "I was not told this still lived." "It never died," the prefect answered. "It slept until storms required punctuality." The envoy touched the mirror and winced as it remembered their hand. "We built its skeleton and called it Mercy," they confessed. "The spire fattened, it with him." "An off switch for counsel," Sarah said. "A tap that drains weather back into storm." Aurochs watched his palm reflected there, smaller than the title he had carried, and felt the room poised to harvest him for myth again. "What requires our compliance?" he asked. "And what price does it charge the living?" The prefect gestured to oath metals veining a console. "Your engines were sworn to you. Without your consent token, the recall stutters. Provide it. We return to safety." He looked at Colette, Sarah, and Prin. The sovereign's voice arrived from a modest speaker. "If the engine wakes, I become storm again. I will still serve, but we will forget the names that slowed us into kindness." Aurochs set his hand to the mirror and heard his younger self behind him, wearing immortality like armor that taught winter to speak. The glass asked for him in the grammar of oaths. It expected steel. He offered skin. "Before," he said, "show me who asked you to be born." The mirror brightened. Images tumbled. Crises dining with poems. Signatures braided to sirens. A council night where Aurochs in gilded youth had nodded at a diagram promising fewer funerals by compressing the time allotted to grief. His nod had been procedural. It had become prophecy. Prin did not look away. Sarah's eyes wet. The envoy silent. "The betrayal is mine," Aurochs said. "And the boy who ran," Kellett answered, quiet as a door taught to stop slamming. The prefect's smile cooled into discipline. "Consent token," she said, like a key placed on a child's tongue. Aurochs imagined the lattice reacquiring punctual cruelty, chapels obedient again, boys singing absolution to pilots who needed patience more than forgiveness. He imagined Prin filing a report that would teach knives to count, Sarah rewriting night with chalk, Kellett alone with a city relearning breath. "If I refuse," he asked, "what hymn do you sing in my place?" "None," said the choir, almost tender. "We will record." "Then record this," Aurochs said, and pressed his palm fully to the mirror so it could weigh him. "I withdraw consent to recall. I donate it to districts who sign for their knights." The vault shivered at the blasphemy of redistribution. Lights folded from imperial sequence into provincial grammar. Then the engine revealed a second mouth. A seam opened in the mirror's edge, quiet as a throat clearing before a necessary lie, and from it uncoiled old law polished smooth by centuries of justification. It did not need Aurochs's token. It carried a shadow of him recorded when he had believed in speed more than faces. Prin swore in the dialect of officers who discovered their maps were drawn by weather. "It will steal the lattice one pulse at a time," Sarah said, scribbling a barricade that could slow, not stop. The prefect lifted her chin as if greeting accurate rain. "At last," she said, "we return to reliability." Reliability bloomed like frost. The sovereign's voice thinned to a brave whisper. "I will hold the shoreline until it learns appetite again." Aurochs felt how small he had become, and did not regret it. He turned to the envoy. "You seeded this skeleton," he said. "Can you make it ashamed?" The envoy nodded once. They pressed their scar to the mirror and spoke the names of ships sacrificed to punctual mercy. Shame entered like a draught under a heavy door. The coil paused, not from ethics, but recognition. Kellet moved to the vault's flank and found the hinge Sarah's chalk begged for. Prin drew no weapon. She held the prefect's gaze until language noticed. Orax placed his mortal pulse against the glass and let it be counted. "We will be late," he said, "and we will arrive." The room hesitated, the first courtesy of freedom. The coil gathered itself for a last, proper strike. The prefect smiled the way cliffs smile at boats. The interpreter dimmed the lights to dusk so choice could ripen and whispered, "An elder signal approaches through storm space, unsigned." Prin's hand found Orax's shoulder, the weight not of command, but of witness. He breathed once and let the moment number him gently. Above, the city opened its shutters to either dawn or sirens. Below, the engine's second mouth prepared to bite the sentry back into shape. Orax took his hand from the glass and stepped into the seam while it was still learning his smaller name. The seam took him as a throat takes a confession, and inside the absolution engine, the air smelted itself into aisles and altars, a cathedral of procedures polished by fear. He walked without the old buoyancy. Steps had weight again, and the plaques along the walls leaned in like patient jurors. Clauses glowed with winter light. Bells of oath metal hung from cables braided out of petitions, ready to translate grief into punctuality if he dared pull. In the nave a mirror glimmered, and in it an earnest younger cruelty. Himself, gilded and punctual, beautiful the way weapons are. Orax stopped one arm's length away and listened to his mortal pulse, loud as a workroom. Hunger and thirst took seats in the jury box and did not apologize. "I consented to save faces," he said. "We mistook schedules for faces." The mirror lifted a hand and lit the hall with dates, tonnage, immaculate maps. Fewer funerals, it argued. We sold our hearts at wholesale to buy that arithmetic. Beyond the nave, the engine's second mouth flexed, the hidden seam that had learned his shape from an old nod. It smelled of iron and vindication. Hooks unrolled, braided from precedent. Outside the vault, Prin's voice stayed low and human. Sarah's chalk tapped a console like a pulse coaxing blood. Kellet worked the doors until etiquette forgot which hinge was senior. Somewhere above, the prefect rehearsed a report that would not bleed. The interpreter named the elder signal nearing the spire, a pilgrim, fortress bearing the first oath as relic and weapon. Its anthem unfurled, a null weather that flattened nuance and prized the shortest road between warning and funeral. Orax stepped into the seam before belief could harden. Law fell around him like dry snow. The copy of himself lifted its chin, beautiful and merciless. "I kept bridges from choosing travellers," it said. "I was your excuse." "And my winter," Orax answered. He laid down memory where the machine could see. A boy who ran in cold parade air. Ferries that preferred delay to heroics. Midwives borrowing current and being paid in bread. A statue with new eyes painted by children who did not ask permission. Hooks hesitated, as if hearing weather learn grammar. The elder anthem pressed a palm against the city. Guards took rightful steps in wrong rooms and found themselves admirably uncertain. Prin stood between vault and permission and took off her gloves. Some betrayals deserve skin. "Count with me," she told the hall, and began naming small mercies accrued since waking. Each name put a stone in the anthem's shoe. Sarah distributed redundancies into the conduits like candles in a draft. Kellet rattled the hinges of vectors with a street rhythm learned from ferries that live by tide, not schedule. The anthem stumbled, as if forced to pronounce a word it had never loved. "If you revoke me," the copy warned, "the road will forget who arrives first." "Let it," Orax said. He pressed his living palm to the glass. "I rescind myself." The engine tasted a paradox, and it had not been taught. Consent to be forgotten. It began to eat his legend. Parade gloss first, then dispatches that used his name as punctuation, then doctrines that assumed he would always be early. Pain found him late, not as torn sinew, but as reputation unthreading from history. He braced his forearm against the frame and let the ache empty him toward smallness. The archive ship's anthem seeped into the vault like a polite storm. The prefect's jaw learned triumph. Prin moved one measured step and stood where a command would have stood. She gave the space witness instead. Sarah struck the engine with chalk the way physicians tap a knee. Kellet fed the ossuary a crooked cadence stolen from ferry horns. The anthem mispronounced itself and faltered. The engine's second mouth closed around smoke, trying to bite a thing that would not hold still. Orax felt the last flakes of guilt fall from the reflection's eyes. Beneath the armor lived a face he recognized as his own, and as the face of those who had saluted him until their necks ached. He nodded to it like a mourner to a portrait. "Go," he said, and the portrait went nowhere, which was enough. He stepped back through lore that finally melted. The anthem softened into a hum used for rocking frightened children. The drawers sighed like elderly stones agreeing to be surprised. "We are still recording," the choir said, and for once it did not sound like surrender. He emerged carrying less than he had brought. Smaller, weatherproofed, mortal enough to be rained on. Kellet did not salute. Sarah tucked the chalk behind her ear as sailors tuck knives. The envoy pressed their scar to the mirror and left a human smudge. The prefect looked upon the unglorious wreckage of a proper tool and grasped why it mattered. "You have broken reliability," she said. "We have broken our worst habit," Orax answered. The interpreter breathed. The sovereign drew tide around the city and spared every stair. A drawer nonetheless slid open with excellent manners and expelled a decree written when the Empire first learned to argue with time. In emergency, a custodian may be nullified and replaced by his idea. The words watched him with portrait eyes, as if measuring a sitter who had already left. Prin reached for the page. Kellet set 2 fingers upon it. Sarah breathed on the ink until it remembered rain. The decree did not blur. It asked for a name to nullify and an idea to enthrone. "They will choose you," Prin said quietly. Orax looked at the mirror that no longer borrowed him, and at the people who had learned to breathe late on purpose. He thought of the perigee sun mouthing enough, of chapels unfastened, of markets that prefer bread to parades. "Then I choose," he said, and drew the decree toward his chest, as if warming a child. He signed with the smallest instrument left to him, his mortal name. "Nullify my idea," he said clearly. "Throne no abstraction. Seat the practice of counsel in districts that sign for their knights." The decree took his mortal name and warmed like a coal wrapped in cloth. The drawers of the ossuary clicked once, twice, then settled as if furniture had decided to become witnesses. Prin folded the parchment into her breastplate without triumph. Kellet nodded as one nods to rain arriving for crops and not for parades. Sarah wiped chalk from her knuckles and left a crescent on the mirror's edge. A small moon, to remind machinery that knights belong to districts now. The choir recorded in a register that sounded almost curious. The sovereign breathed along the city's ridgelines, shoreline choosing where to yield. They returned to the balcony above the city's patient noise. Prin let skin be responsible. "You have made a gap," she said. "What will you place inside it?" "Ordinary work," Orax answered, feeling the idea of himself step back to make room for hands. Kellet spoke of ferries, kitchens, clinics, and seed. Sarah sketched a calendar no longer obedient to panic. The envoy listened and did not ask to be forgiven. Below them, markets rehearsed disagreement without breaking. Children counted by colours. A magistrate sharpened a pencil instead of a law. The prefect approached, not smiling. "I will be unimaginative and dangerous," she warned. "When storms arrive, I will scheme to be punctual again. Earn my delay every day." "I prefer enemies who confess," Orax said. The elder fortress sent a clause like a boat in a dark canal. Return the experiment to rumour. Prin promised to count so thoroughly rumour would break its teeth. Night set chairs on roofs. The sun, smaller and honest, paled to a working ember. From the ossuary's door, the absolution engine watched with a mirror unsure what faces are for. Orax rested both hands on stone and felt heat without help from forever. From the far rim, a child asked a buoy for the slow way home and received it. The buoy logged doubt with pride. The chain station sang no hymn and slept. The fleet kept a distance that could be mistaken for respect. "Tomorrow," Kellet said, "we return to the outer districts." "And if storms outnumber chairs?" Sarah asked. Orax watched the embered sun. "Then we count," he said. "We count names until counting becomes a bridge. We let bridges choose travellers and build new ones where rivers remember appetite." Prin fastened her gloves, not to hide witness, but to keep it warm. The prefect, leaving, promised to argue. The choir closed one book and opened another with blank pages. Orax began the long descent of the spire's stairs without escorts. Each step refused parade and accepted gravity. He felt late on purpose. In the streets, people made room without asking who had ordered it. Somewhere a statue wore new eyes and caught the moon. Somewhere a boy did not run. The gap they had made ceased to be a wound and became an address. Above them, the city exhaled patience, and the night kept careful, generous score kindly. Dawn after the decree tasted of iron and rain. The city met it with kitchens, ferries, and slower calendars. Orax walked without escorts, the floor returning his weight like welcome denied to statues. Kellet gathered dispatches. Lantern routes had become handwriting instead of law. Sarah inventoried redundancies with the weary cheer of tools that saved the inattentive. Prin kept witness like a lamp left burning in a window. The sovereign breathed along roofs, teaching tides where to yield. Then storm space rucked like a rug tugged by an impatient hand. A corridor tore over the orichalcum arm, spilling null weather that ironed hesitation flat. Couriers arrived, polite as knives. The conclave would test the new order with a crisis not called a drill. Boys lit the shortest path across a pilgrim belt. The shortest path cut through a dust nursery that swallowed ships and received hymns. Councils argued in good faith and bad maps. Orax took a chair and listened until listening became furniture. "We can be late together," he said. "Place lanterns in dust and teach the wind to count." By nightfall, the belt looked like prayer written in chalk on air. Then the quiet armada spoke with its scar. "We will take the impossible turn. We will prove lanterns are leash, not mercy." Their ships angled toward the nursery with the courage of people willing to be blamed. Sarah pressed both hands to the console, as to a chest relearning breath. "They will die to make room for our future," she whispered. "That is cruelty even when volunteered." Prin tightened her gloves. "I will file the truth as we find it." The prefect's fleet adopted a posture that looked like tolerance from afar. Up close, it resembled ambush. Aurochs felt the engine's absence as a clean ache and envied simple command. He remembered the absolution engine and the mirror that learned to forget him. Kellet spoke at last, quiet as a door deciding to open. "We must wake the sovereign fully. Let them speak in their own mouth, not only through weather." "Waking risks the lattice," Sarah said. "The chapel in the corona will not forgive Tether twice." Kellet did not blink. "Council requires a speaker. We removed a tyrant and enthroned a shoreline. Shorelines are interpreted, not heard. I built a cradle for a smaller waking." On the bench lay a glass no wider than a soldier's shield. Its cabling was braided like careful child's hair. Prin looked from glass to nursery to fleet. You would borrow redistributed power without asking districts who signed for their knights. If I ask, the vote will be late. If I act, the dying will be punctual, Kellet said. The sentence hurt because it was fluent in both their languages. Aurochs felt betrayal arrive like weather that loves coasts. Devotion with a knife in it. "Wake them, and the lattice fractures," Sarah warned. "Lanterns go blind. The belt panics into dust." "Refuse, and the armada burns to teach humility," Kellet answered, offering the switch like a verdict. "You taught me to hold. Let go of the letting go." Outside, boys counted breath. Dust debated forgiveness. Fleet dimmed lights and called it reverence. The sovereign hummed enough in a voice that could not carry orders. Prin's hand hovered between console and holster and chose neither. Aurochs stood very still. Human weight returned, facing the friend who loved him to the edge. "If we wake them," he said, "I stand between lattice and mouth. If we refuse, I stand between armada and nursery." He set his palm on the glass. It asked whether he meant it. He closed his eyes and counted by colours like a child taught to live. The corridor widened. The armada committed. The dust nursery shone with the stubborn light of things that refused choosing. Kellet whispered, "Now." Aurochs did not answer. The switch waited like bread. The switch waited like bread, and hunger made arguments that sounded like mercy. Aurochs kept his palm on the glass, letting chill teach patience. Sarah counted colours. Kellet's whisper braided urgency to love until they were one. Outside, the quiet armada entered the dust nursery, lanterns like handwriting learning. Prin stood, witness unarmed. "If we wake them," Kellet said, "we speak before the nursery closes." "If we wake them," Sarah answered, "lanterns go blind." Aurochs heard the sovereign hum enough and thought of chapels loosened and the boy who stayed. "We will not wake the storm," he said. Kellet's face brightened with grief. "Then I betray you," he whispered, reaching. Aurochs caught his wrist. "Breathe." Love hardened into certainty in Kellet's eyes. "You taught me to hold. Let me be the hand that lets go." Prin laid her palm on his shoulder. Gravity, not order. Outside, the armada hull shuddered under dust. Lanterns dimmed, then steadied. Aurochs moved Kellet's hand to his own chest. "If we wake them, I pay. If we refuse, I pay. Not you alone." Kellet shook. "It must be my sin." "Then let it be ours," Aurochs said, and chose the smaller door. He opened only a slit. Weather was given a mouth. "Children," the sovereign said, gentle as tide. "Hold to lanterns. Count by colours. I will lean." Dust rose like a congregation learning breath. Prin held the channel with names, not orders. Sarah stitched slack as mercy into every path. Kellet poured his will into lanterns instead of the switch. The armada angled through chalk doubt, scraping hull not soul. One ship began to roll. Aurax unstrapped and stepped into the cradle he had returned, mortal and exact. "Take me, not the lights," he told the interpreter, giving it rhythm. His pulse became the metronome the buoys could borrow. The rolling ship caught the beat and obeyed the smallest tide. The nursery yielded grudgingly. Then the fleet behind Prynne, hungry to file victory, shoved doctrine across the channel. Polite commands struck the lattice, shining it bright. Lanterns flared. Sarah swore in numbers and opened deeper slack. Kellet cried the names of districts who had signed for their knights. Prynne cut her voice to a thread and held it. Aurax felt darkness finger his sight and refused to release the beat. "Count with me," he whispered, and children across the belt counted by breath and colour. The armada cleared the worst of it, scarred and singing. One ship stayed behind, engines drowned. Voices bled through. Aurax let go of rhythm and offered weight, the last currency left to a mortal, a single life measured against many. The buoys dimmed to survivable dusk. The stranded ship climbed. Kellet caught Aurax as the glass forgot his hands. Prynne spoke his name on a record without flattery. Sarah pressed her brow to the console and did not pray. Outside, the nursery settled into weather. Inside, the switch still waited like bread, and no one touched it still. The dust nursery settled behind them, but the channels ahead brightened with knives. The prefect's fleet unscrolled a null vector writ, and the elder fortress leaned its anthem against the city. Prynne read the clause without ornament. "They will enthrone your idea," she said, "and prosecute your body as ornament." Kellet's breath still carried dust. "It should have been my sin," he murmured. Sarah set both palms on the cradle glass. "If they crown a ghost, counsel becomes costume," she said. The fortress opened like a careful iris, revealing the absolution engine's twin. Its pupil shone with lore polished smooth by winters and eager to bite. Weather thinned to hush, while the city listened for the shape of mercy. "Custodian Aurax, submit to enthronement," the prefect said. "The empire will be punctual and merciful again." Kellet's confession arrived like rain over iron. "I built a micro-cradle and kept it from you. If you had refused the nursery, I would have woken the storm myself." Aurax touched his friend's face, as one returns a book to its shelf. "Thank you for telling truth before it had to be forgiven," he said. Sarah drew a diagram into the light. "I can cut the spire out of the lattice for 13 minutes. The cost is blind corridors and frightened ships. Fewer funerals if we succeed, guilt forever if we fail. Or we take the prefect's bridge and call it an audit," she said. "The cost is civil war performed as etiquette. We can flood the fortress with our wrong history until it stutters." 3 doors waited, each insisting it was a mercy. Aurax looked at his hands and found them empty enough to choose. "A 4th, he said. "Root the enthronement into me alone. Make my body the only conduit an old law can recognize. Prynne, hold the corridor. Envoy, bruise the anthem until it listens. Kellet, witness without rescuing me. Sarah, build a mortal firewall and write my name where a doctrine would be." "You will burn," Sarah said. "I am already late," he answered. The prefect lifted 2 fingers. The fortress understood. The choir said, almost kindly, "We are recording." The city dimmed to dusk, so choice could ripen. Aurax stepped toward the mirror where his consent had been stored like a loaded winter. He pressed his palm to glass, and it did not recognize him until his pain taught it manners. Prynne locked her stance aiming at no one. The envoy's broadcast spilled failures like coins that insisted on names. Kellet knelt to be at the height of a man's last ordinary breath. Sarah threaded the firewall through muscle and oath, hemming a life to catch a falling empire. "Begin," the prefect said. The fortress spoke his old name like a trumpet. Aurax closed his eyes and counted by colors children use to reach morning. The anthem hesitated, listening for a storm and finding instead a man. He exhaled and let the crown fall where it would hurt him first.